Welcome to Fairy Tale Flip. I'm Vanessa Y. Rogers, the hostess of Fabric of Folklore, and these are my two oldest children. You want to introduce yourself?
My name is Declan. My name is Evelyn.
And in Fairy Tale Flip, we read 3 different stories and let you, the audience, choose which story we will delve into every month with Donna Lee Fields from Doorways to Learning. And so one of the options that we're choosing this month that was suggested was The Girl Who Trod on a Loaf. And that's by Hans Christian Andersen. And unfortunately, the book that I got didn't actually have that story. I thought I was getting a full collection, but it wasn't. So I printed it out and I put it in this book just so I have something to hold on to for the story. So are y'all excited?
Yes, very excited.
What do you think this story is going to be about?
Yeah, I think this story is going to be about a mermaid, a girl,
A mommy?
a mermaid,
A mermaid? Okay. You think it's going to be about a girl?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What do you think is going to happen?
Mermaid. I think she's mermaid is gonna go on is gonna sneak the treasure chest and put an octopus in it and the other mermaid.
Okay, yeah. Well, those are the pictures on the front, but remember I had to print it out, so this is not representational of what's inside the story, right? Okay. The Girl Who Trod on a Loaf. There was All right. There was once a girl who trod on a loaf to avoid soiling her shoes, making her shoes dirty. And this is the story
I
of.
hate making my shoes dirty.
Yeah, I don't like that either. And the misfortunes that happened to her in consequence are well known. So this girl's name was Inga, and she was a poor child from a poor family, but she had a bad and cruel disposition. When she was a little girl, she would catch flies and she would tear off their wings, and she would put pins in beetles and stick through them, and she was just generally not a kind little girl. But she was very pretty, and so a lot of people excused her bad behavior. Her mother would tell her, "Your headstrong will require severity to conquer it. As a little child, you used to trample on my apron, but one day I fear you will trample on my heart." And alas, this fear was one day realized. Inga was
spoiling the book.
I'm telling you a little bit of the end of the story, huh? Inga was taken to the house of some rich people who lived at a distance and who treated her as their own child. And they would dress her up in finery and nice clothing. But she became arrogant and prideful. When she had been there for about a year, her adopted mother told her, "You should go visit your parents." So Inga went to go visit her parents from her village. But when she reached the entrance of her village, she saw young men and young ladies laboring. And her mother was among them and sitting on a stone with a bundle of sticks. Here's some pictures, yeah. This is her pulling wings off of flies. Her mother was sitting on a stone, and she was with bundling a bundle of sticks before her that she had picked up. And Inga, instead of pity for her mother's poverty, felt pride and ashamed of her mother. And so she didn't even say hi to her mother. She just left. About a half a year went by again, and her adopted mother said, "You ought to go home and visit your poor parents. I have baked them a large loaf of bread, and they will be so glad to see you." So Inga put on her best clothes and her best new shoes. You looking at the pictures? Her best new shoes.
Yeah.
And went to, and she started walking towards her village, but she came across a moor, which is kind of like a swampy area, and there was a lot of mud. And instead of stepping in the pools of water, she threw the loaf of bread that had been baked for her mother into the moor so that her shoes wouldn't get dirty. But as she stood with one foot on the loaf and the other one lifted up to step forward, the loaf began to sink under her. And it lowered and lowered until only a few bubbles on the surface of the muddy pool remained to show where she had sunk. And this is the story. Where do you think she went? She sank into the ground and went down to where the marsh woman was. The marsh woman, who is related to elf maidens, who are well known for songs who are sung and pictures painted about them, but of this marsh woman nothing is known, except that when the mist arises from the meadows in the summertime, it's because she is brewing beneath them. A heap of mud is a palace compared to the marsh woman's brewery, and as Inga fell, she shuddered in every limb and soon became cold and stiff as marble. And her foot was still fastened to the loaf, which was bowed down to her as a golden ear of corn bends the stem. An evil spirit soon took possession of Inga and carried her still to a worse place, where she saw crowds of unhappy people waiting in a state of agony. And these were all miserable people who were also cruel and unkind people. Yes, just like that. Yeah, that's Inga. Goodness, Dobby.
And who is this?
That's Inga. Dobby, you're on the microphone. Thank you.
Over here.
Okay, so she's surrounded by lots of people. She's surrounded by lots of people who are very, very miserable all around her. And she's hungry and she's cold. And she's now turned into a kind of statue because she can't move. She can't move at all. She can't turn her head and she can't move her leg. And she's hungry. And not only that, but flies are landing on her. Wingless flies, like the wings, like the flies that she used to pull the wings off of, right? And there's snakes and there's frogs that are landing on her. But because she can't move, she can't get rid of them. She can't make them go anywhere. She just has to endure it. And she says, Dobby, come on. And she says, if this lasts much longer, I shall not be able to bear it. But she did have to bear it because there was nothing else for her to do. And a tear, followed by many scalding tears, fell upon her head and rolled over her face and neck and down the loaf which she was fastened to. And she thought, who could be weeping for me? And soon she heard her mother's voice, because although she was a statue and she was deep, deep underground, she could hear the voices of people all speaking her name, because above on the surface, people knew of her bad deeds, and people knew what had happened because a cowherd had seen her falling deep, deep into the mud and the bog and the moor.
Oh, I think that was quicksand.
It's a little bit like quicksand, yeah. And so she heard her mother's voice.
So they put a little of quicksand in there.
Quicksand in the moor?
Uh-huh.
And she heard her mother's voice, and she heard her mother saying, oh, Inga, you did trample on my heart. And then she heard the sounds, the tears of her adopted mother. And her adopted mother said, oh, Inga was such a sinful girl. She did not value the gifts of God, but trampled them under her feet. And Inga thought to herself, they should have punished me. They should have driven all my naughty tempers out of me. And a song was made about Inga, the girl who trod on a loaf to keep her shoes from being soiled. And the song was sung everywhere. And the story of her sin was also told by all the little children, and they called her Wicked Inga. And they thought her to be so naughty that she ought to be punished. And Inga heard all of this, and her heart became hardened and full of bitterness. But one day, while her hunger and grief were gnawing in her hollow frame, she heard a little innocent child. And the little innocent child began to say, she exclaimed, but will she never come up again? And she heard her mother say, no, she will never come up again. And the little girl said, "But if she were to say, 'I'm sorry,' and ask for forgiveness and promise never to be naughty again?" And the mother said, "Yes, she might come up again, but she will never beg pardon." And the little girl said, "Oh, but I wish she would. I wish she would. I'd be so glad, and I would give up my doll and all my playthings if she could come up again. Poor Inga, it's so dreadful for her." And these pitying words penetrated Inga's heart, and it seemed to do her good because it was the first time she had ever heard anyone say poor Inga without saying something about her being naughty or about her faults. And so it made Inga feel quite strange. And she wished at that moment that she could actually cry for herself. After this, later on, years and years went by, and she heard her mother say, she heard her dying mother say, "Oh, Inga, you have been so, what a grief you have been to me." And she heard her adoptive mother say, "Oh, poor Inga, shall I never see you again? Perhaps I may." But Inga knew right well that her mistress would never see her again. Long time passed, and the little girl who had cried for her turned into an old lady, and on her deathbed, Inga heard her name pronounced once more and saw what seemed to be two bright stars shining above her. They were two gentle eyes closing on earth. Many years had passed since the little girl had lamented and wept about poor Inga, and she shed tears over Inga and prayed now, and the eyes of the old woman closed to earth, the eyes of the soul opened upon the hidden things of eternity. And then she, in whose last thoughts Inga had been so vividly present, saw how deeply the poor girl had sunk. She burst into tears at the sight, and in heaven, as she had done when a little girl on earth, she wept and prayed for poor Inga, and her tears and her prayers echoed through the dark void, surrounded the tormented captive soul, and unexpected mercy was obtained for it through angels' tears. And in thought, Inga seemed to act over again sin she had committed on earth, and she trembled, and tears she had never been able to weep rushed to her eyes. It seemed impossible that the gates of mercy could ever be opened to her while she acknowledged this in deep, deep penitence, and a beam of radiant light shot suddenly into the depths of her, more powerful than the sunbeams that dissolve a snowman. And her stony form of Inga changed into a little bird, and she soared with the speed of lightning upon the world of mortals, and she flew into the earth. But unlike most birds, she couldn't sing. She could feel the radiance of the sunlight and the light of the moon, but she couldn't sing of all the beauty she felt and saw around her. Until one Christmas morning, an old peasant put out an ear of corn for all the birds around him. And all these little birds started twittering around eating the corn. And the little bird that was Inga, that was sitting on the stone, decided to start doing good deeds. And she started to find all the breadcrumbs all around her, and she would eat the little breadcrumbs, a few of them, and then she would call to all the other birds and say, "Here are the breadcrumbs, come eat, come eat." And so after this way she collected many crumbs and given them to the other birds until they equaled the weight of the loaf on which Inga had trod to keep her shoes clean. And when the last breadcrumb had been found and given, the gray wings of the bird became white and spread themselves out for flight. And other children cried, "Oh, look out there! There's a seagull!" And when they saw the white bird, it dived into the sea and rose again into the sunlight. And it was glittering, and no one could tell where it went, but some thought it went straight into the sun. The end. So what did you think about that story?
It was about a mermaid.
It was about a mermaid? That was silly. What did you think?
It's about a girl. I thought it was good.
You liked it?
A lot. No.
Okay. So if this is the story, Evelyn, sit down, please. If this is the story that you want us to do a deep dive into to understand a little bit better, make sure that you vote on The Girl Who Trod on a Loaf. So thank you so much for listening to Fairy Tale Flip Storytime. And we can't hear to Evelyn, we can't wait to hear your thoughts about the story and what you thought about this story. Thanks so much.
For more fairy tale flip insights like this one, please press like and subscribe.